as the Democrats and Republicans both try to appeal to the American public in their conventions differently, the wildfires in California are becoming more urgent every day. Our guest today is coming to us from California, which he says has been converted into a massive fire zone. Today, we're talking about what it's like there and what the lack of political response says about our future on this planet. Sasha Abramsky is a freelance journalist, teaches journalism at UC Davis, and he writes the column Signal Noise twice a week for The Nation magazine. He also writes a column for Truthout. You've seen him in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The Guardian, New York Times, Rolling Stone, and here we're lucky to have him as a recurring guest on our program here on act.tv. Sasha, thanks for joining us.
Hello again. How are you?
Hi. Well, do me a favor. You're in California for the third straight year. California and the states there are struggling to cope with fires. Trump is not responding to this climate catastrophe. Can you talk about what it's like to be there right now?
Yeah, I mean, basically, if I were able to take my computer over to the window and show viewers the air outside, you'd see the weather forecast says blue skies and sun, and the reality is this toxic gray rooftop level fog, which isn't really a fog, it's a smoke haze. And that smoke haze is blowing in over Sacramento, where I live, from 1.3 million acres or 1,500 square miles of fires, 600 fires that are going simultaneously throughout California. Now, California always gets fires. That's part of the California ecosystem. What we're seeing now and have seen for the last several years is more fires. They're coming earlier in the season. They're not waiting for the Santa Ana winds to blow out in October. They're starting in August. And they're going all the way through to the end of the year. And they're not just in the traditional fire zones, but they're all over the state now. So what happened the other day, about 4 or 5 days ago, maybe a week ago at this point, there were a series of dry lightning storms that were triggered by super hot weather, where it went up to 110 degrees all around Northern California. And we ended up with these very powerful dry lightning storms. And there were 12,000 strikes. And those lightning strikes set forests afire, basically, and set grasslands afire. And so you had hundreds of fires emerging simultaneously, growing really, really quickly because there were these dry winds that accompanied the lightning storms. And within hours, you had hundreds of thousands of acres on fire. So now all through California, you have these fire complexes that are mixing and merging. So you may have 50 or 60 different fires, and then they merge into one super fire. And that's what we're finding. Basically, every firefighting unit is on call. There are firefighting units coming in from around the western states. I think even Australia has donated some firefighters to fly in. You talked about the federal response. This is what's happened every year. We've had these super fires during Trump's administration. Trump comes out and he tweets insults about California's political leadership. He tweets insults about its environmental policy. And then he makes these inane recommendations about raking the leaves off the forest floor and so on. Now, eventually he does get around to declaring a federal disaster, and eventually he liberates federal assistance, FEMA assistance, and other assistance for the state. And this happened in 2018, happened in 2019, and now it's happened this year too. He spent several days tweeting out these inane insults. Eventually he and Gavin Newsom get on the phone, and eventually the aid starts flowing. But the thing is, Trump clearly regards California's fires as an opportunity. He regards it as a political prop. So even if eventually Californians get assistance, they get assistance with caveats. And the trade-off is they have to tolerate Trump's nonsense as he blathers on about environmental policy causing fires for days on end. And this is stupidity. This is absolute stupidity. Trump this week basically finalized the opening up of the Arctic Wildlife Refuge in Alaska to oil and gas drilling. He's doing everything he can to reduce controls on methane gas emission. He's doing everything he can to undermine solar and other renewable energies. And he's doing this at the moment when we're living climate change. Not 5, 10, 20 years down the road as a hypothetical, but we're living climate change, especially in California today. It's extraordinary.
The man is the incarnation of evil. I mean,
he is, and he has no sense of any responsibility to a greater good than himself. His sister talked about that on these secret recordings. He doesn't care about climate change. He doesn't care about mass population displacement. He doesn't care about all the health implications that come with asthma and everything else that comes with the pollution. He cares about Donald Trump and scoring political points.
And this is, I think it bears underlining the idea that, these people, whether it's Fox or people on the right, or even just any people who said, you know what, we need to get politicians out of politics and we need to get a business person in politics. Well, a business person under capitalism is all about the bottom line. And this one is specifically about his own bottom line. And he can't break out of that thinking to then help people who are in a crisis. He does not know how to do it. He is ill-equipped for this job. He is also evil, but he is, at the base of him, he is ill-equipped to do this job. He just doesn't have the philosophy about it.
Well, you look at that. You played some of those clips from last night about Trump's sort of faux empathy exercise. And this was just so laughable because this is a man who has made a career on the understanding that empathy makes you weak. That if you put yourself in someone else's shoes, if you can understand how someone's suffering or vulnerable, it makes you somehow less of a man. That's been Trump's whole philosophy throughout his career, his political career, his business career. And then last night we see Trump try to metamorphose into, I don't know, Dr. Phil or something. I hear your pain. I feel you're suffering. Tell me about your work as a janitor. Yes, it's extraordinary. There was nothing genuine in that. There was nothing caring. This was a man who, when you force him to listen for a minute to someone else's story, his every body language shows you he doesn't care.
He literally, in that one woman who said she was a janitor or a custodian, I believe she said, at the post office, he just said, oh, that's a business that's never going to go out of business. He's thinking business as opposed to this person who puts her hands into the mail system when there's a pandemic and she's risking her life so that other people can get their medications and also their Amazon packages. But anyway, different story about that.
Yeah, look, I mean, Trump is at his weakest in terms of his rhetorical skills when he's trying to hew to a script. When he improvises and he riffs, he's incoherent, but it connects with an audience. There's his sort of Trumpian, raw, weird, strange energy. When he's on script, which, for example, he was after the Charlottesville massacre, when he made the Charlottesville neo-Nazi demos, when he made this terrible statement that there were equally good people on both sides. And then he had to backpedal the next day by going on camera and reading a script saying, actually, Nazis are very bad people. And it was patently insincere.
Oops.
You saw that last night when he was pretending to be empathic. And he'd clearly been told by his script writers, by the producers, the apprentice producers they brought on, show a little bit of empathy, do a little bit of Joe Biden if you can. He can't. The Trump show is all about Donald Trump. When you try and make the Trump show about someone else, it falls flat on its face, and it will every time, because this whole spectacle is a one-man show at this point.
Sasha, returning to the lack of federal response for the California wildfires, do you believe that President Trump is exacting political retribution for California's lack of MAGA?
Yeah, Politico reported on this about a week ago at the beginning of this fire season. And they said that they quoted an unnamed Trump official who said Trump very clearly told people he wanted to withhold fire aid from California as political payback. He doesn't like California. He doesn't like the fact that California's attorney general has sued the Trump administration on immigration issues, on environmental issues repeatedly, and won many of these cases. He does want to wreak political vengeance on California, and he thinks there's political capital to be made in doing that. And so you see this dramatically different response when there's a natural disaster, a hurricane or a tornado in a red state. Trump's all over it immediately. He goes down.
I was wondering about that because we're about to have a hurricane in the red states along the Gulf.
It's going to be interesting. In the middle of the Republican convention, Louisiana is going to be slammed by first a tropical storm earlier this week and then a hurricane later in the week. And it is going to be interesting to see if the Republicans ignore it, as they virtually did with California yesterday, or if they make a big political play. We've got your back, we're going to get assistance down your way. I suspect the latter. I suspect they're going to go out of their way to show that they protect their own, that they protect red state voters. But what they're not doing is a basic duty of American governance. They're not respecting all Americans, whatever their politics, who need assistance. So you're seeing that with California, the lack of federal response, the lack of federal empathy. You certainly saw it with Puerto Rico after the hurricane a couple of years back, where the closest we came to a federal response that was, in any way public was Trump going to Puerto Rico and throwing rolls of toilet paper to desperate
paper towels. But yeah, I'm surprised he didn't come and throw toilet paper us in New York City during the pandemic when toilet paper wasn't.
That's just something
short supply.
That's Trump trying to be empathic. It shows you what happens when Trump is told, hey, you got to show sympathy or empathy for someone else. His vision of that is throwing paper at desperate hurricane victims.
We've been watching as both the Republicans and Democrats lay out their climate plans. Obviously, Democrats have a much better response, but neither seem to be meeting the moment that California and the rest of the world are in. How can we translate these fires and hurricanes to urgent calls for climate action?
Well, when I was writing about criminal justice 25 years ago, back when it was extremely politically unpopular to talk about the fact that we were putting too many young people in prison, the fact that we had a schools-to-prison pipeline and everything else. If you tried to talk about that, you risk just being seen as this wishy-washy liberal and soft on crime and everything else. But the one area, I did a lot of public speaking back then on criminal justice reform, and the one area I found that you could connect with quite conservative voters on was when you translated it into an economic conversation. So when you started saying, well, forget about whether or not you think a young person deserves 10 years in prison for a low-end drug crime. Forget about the morals. Let's talk about the economics. How much money are we spending locking that one person up for 10 years? Oh, $500,000. Well, that's a lot of money. How much money are we not spending on schools or on infrastructure or even on policing because we're spending it on locking that young person up? And suddenly you open up the conversation. That if you turn it into an economic nuts and bolts conversation, dollars and cents, you can get a lot of people who are going to buy into that conversation in a way they don't when you just talk about the morality. Mm-hmm. And it's the same with climate change. For various reasons, there are a lot of Americans, maybe a lot of people all around the world, who find it very difficult to grasp the morality of the climate change conversation. And they don't quite understand or don't quite care about the human displacement, the human misery that comes with climate change. But if you say, look, California's on fire, and that comes with a massive economic cost. It comes not just at a few $1 million, but at tens of billions of dollars. It breaks economies. When you have climate change on this scale, you have massive economic implications. Then you can have a broader conversation. And I think the Democrats should be doing that day after day after day. They should be talking about the moral urgency of climate change, but they should also be talking about the economic urgency of tackling it now and how much more it's going to cost down the road if we delay all of this action.
Well, that would be great if they actually wanted to do something about climate change. It certainly seems like yesterday we had a guest on from the from the platform committee who talked about how the Democrats refused to, or they just decided they were not going to be standing by their pledge of 2016 to get rid of subsidies to oil and gas companies. The Democrats are still a corporate party. So with corporate parties fighting each other, what hope do we have to actually use that economic argument to stop climate change?
I mean, the Democrats are a corporate party, but they're also quite a big tent, and their politics does go from AOC or Bernie Sanders all the way through to, I don't know,
Joe Biden. Or even further.
Michael Bloomberg, but actually on climate, Bloomberg's very good, or he's relatively good. I think there is room for that conversation in the Democratic Party. I don't think there's room for it in the Republican Party, because unlike, for example, conservative parties in Europe, which have gotten very, very concerned about climate change, the Republican Party is a denialist party. If the science is inconvenient, whether it's on climate, whether it's on pandemic, the Republican Party's answer is, well, we'll ignore the science and we'll indulge in magical wishful thinking. And so the Republican Party are wedded to this notion that we can simply talk away the realities of climate change. You're not going to get creative, smart thinking on climate change from Donald Trump's GOP. You're probably not going to get it from Marco Rubio or Mitt Romney's GOP. It's a party that just doesn't care about the environment, which means the last best hope at the moment in the American system is the Democratic Party. It doesn't mean if Biden comes into power, he's going to be perfect on the environment. He won't be. But there will be space for a conversation there that there wouldn't be under a Trump administration Mark II, version 2.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Trump's done in his first term in office when it comes to environmental policy, far and away the worst environmental president of modern times. If he came in on a second term, it's going to be pillage and plunder for the fossil fuel industry for the foreseeable future. It's going to be an absolute nightmare.
I'm terrified. So you're on the ground in California. Do you see people who are being affected in California, and maybe we can extrapolate this to other areas, who would be Trump voters being switched, being convinced that they need to do something to switch parties, at least for this election, because of the personal trauma they are living through?
I'm going to duck that question, not because I don't want to answer it, but just because I don't have enough information. I haven't been out and about talking to rural Californians who are having to flee their homes in these fires. You do see them. I mean, this happens whenever there's a fire season like this in California. What you see is a huge number of people who've had to flee their homes at short notice, and they're clearly living out of their cars and rest areas on the freeways. And you see that every year. You see these people who pack their vitals into their cars, and they're going to sleep wherever they can for a week or two until hopefully they have a home to go back to. But I don't know if that's changing their political vote. I don't know if it's changing their approach to the environment. I do know that Californians, by and large, are pretty progressive on the environment. Not everybody and not every part of the state, but it's a state which has embraced the notion that we need to get serious about climate change. And I do think to a degree that transcends ideology here, because everybody's living it. If you're in a state where you're now getting basically 5 months a year of unpredictable fire, that's catastrophic. And you see these images, those are the same images you could have seen in 2019, in 2018, in 2017. And every year the acreage burnt is expanding, and every year the number of people losing their homes runs into the many thousands. It's a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe whether you're Democrat, Republican, or anything else. And unless we get a handle on this, it's going to render large parts of this state uninhabitable. Not least, people won't be able to get fire insurance. And if you can't get fire insurance, you can't live in the house that you own, because you'll lose everything if there's a fire.
From your piece, California is burning and Trump gathers kindling, which folks can go and read. Unlike Biden, who is his power in his power, you say, unlike Biden, who in his powerful and focused acceptance speech last Thursday argued that it was a moral imperative to provide young people with hope for a cleaner, greener, less environmentally degraded future. Trump does nothing but carp about, insult, and mock those who take environmental policy seriously. Do you think that there studies have shown that even Republicans are starting to believe that climate change is kind of a problem? Do you think we're going to see anything in the RNC that is a nod to the fact that the climate is changing?
I don't think we can. They've staked their fortune to the notion that climate change is either a hoax or is not really man-made, or even if it's man-made, it's not that serious. And when you've got a party that wedded to the most regressive parts of the energy industry, the fossil fuel industry, look, this is an administration that has opposed even the auto companies that want more fuel-efficient vehicles. And it's doing it not as a sop to the auto industry, it's doing it primarily as a sop to the fossil fuel industry. Everything about this administration is short-term. There's no long-term thinking, whether it's strategic thinking or moral thinking. There's nothing beyond how can we get political or economic capital around the bend. So if everything is short-termism, you can't address climate change, because definitionally climate change is about thinking generationally or intergenerationally. So no, you're not going to get anything meaningful out of this Republican convention on the environment. I suspect they're basically either going to ignore it or mock environmental policy and say that it will result in blackouts and tax increases and all the other things they've been saying environmentalism leads to. And so you don't expect any, you may get some tokenistic words of support for the fire victims in California, but don't expect any meaningful policy or economic interventions here to try and bend the curve on this.
Sasha, thank you so much for joining us. Sasha Abramsky, freelance journalist and teacher of journalism at UC Davis, who writes the Signal Noise column twice weekly for The Nation. Sasha, are you going to be teaching in person, or are you still virtual over at UC Davis?
So classes start in a few weeks. I'll be teaching from the same room that I'm doing this interview in now.
Excellent. Will you be doing the fun backgrounds again?
I may.
I love it. I love it. Thanks again for being a guest on our program. It's always enlightening to have you here. Thank you so much. And I look forward to your next visit with us.
I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
You can follow Sasha Abramsky on Twitter at Abramsky, Abramsky. Sasha, Sasha. Thanks for watching. I'm Julianna Forlano. If you're watching us on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe. We bring you progressive news, views, ideas, thoughts, and even some radical ones. We have a spectrum on the left, from left to lefter. You can follow me on Twitter at Julianna Forlano. Follow act.tv across all the different platforms, because we're pretty much everywhere. And sometimes you have to spell out act.tv because of whatever. They don't let you use punctuation. But hey, you'll find us. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Well, we'll see you tomorrow when our guest on our live program is Jamia Wilson. She is the feminist activist and author of Step Into Your Power and Young, Gifted, and Black, among other works. It's always a joy to have her on. It's always a joy to be here with you. Until then, have a great day.